This is the skeletal system. The bones of our skeleton are part of the skeletal system, which also includes joints, cartilage, and ligaments. The skeleton is divided into two parts, the axial skeleton, which includes the bones of the longitudinal axis, and the appendicular skeleton, which are the bones of the limbs and the girdles. The longitudinal axis includes the skull, vertebral column, and thoracic cage, which includes the ribs and the sternum. The appendicular skeleton includes the shoulders to fingers, the pelvis, and the legs to the toes. In this picture, the green portions are part of the axial skeleton, while the yellow parts show the appendicular skeleton. The skeletal system's major contribution to our body is to provide structure and support, but it also provides protection to organs such as the heart, lungs, and the brain. It allows our body to move through the attachment of muscle to bones and through our joints. The bones store fats and minerals such as calcium and phosphorus, and also is a place for blood cell formation in the marrow cavities. There are two basic types of bone tissue, compact and spongy. The compact bone is dense and loose, smooth, where the spongy bone sort of looks like a sponge. There are four classifications to bone shape, which includes the long bones, the flat bones, the short bones, and the irregular bones. Long bones would be in your arms and legs. The flat bones would be like your sternum. The irregular bones are all of the other things that aren't any of the other options, and then short bones are in your wrists and your ankles. Long bones are typically longer than they are wide. They have a shaft with large ends and are composed of mostly compact bone. All bones of the limbs, except for the kneecap and the wrist and ankle bones, are considered long bones. Flat bones are thin, flattened, and usually curved. They have two thin layers of compact bone between a layer of spongy bone. The bones of the skull, ribs, and sternum are all flat bones. Short bones are generally cube-shaped and contain mostly spongy bone with an outer layer of compact bone. The bones in the wrist and ankle are short bones. Sesamoid bones, such as the kneecap, form within tendons and produce a special type of short bone. All other bones are classified as irregular bones. The vertebrae, which makes up the spinal column, fall into this group. Like short bones, they're mainly spongy bone with an outer layer of compact bone. In the long bone, the diaphysis, or the shaft, makes up most of the bone length. The diaphysis is covered by the periosteum, which is a fibrinous connective tissue. The periosteum is connected to the bone by Sharpie's fibers or perforating fibers. The epiphysis are the ends of the long bones, which are filled with spongy bone. Instead of the periosteum, articular cartilage or hyaline cartilage covers the external surface. This cartilage is glassy and provides a smooth surface to decrease friction at the joint when covered by a lubricating fluid. In adult bones, there's a thin line of bone tissue that expands across the epiphysis called the epiphyseal line. This is the adult line of the epiphyseal plate, or growth plate that's found in children. This is where the lengthwise growth of bones take place. The inner bony surface of the shaft is covered by connective tissue called the endosteum. The center cavity of the bone is called the medullary cavity and is the storage place for red marrow in infants. The red marrow produces blood cells until it gets replaced by yellow marrow, which stores adipose tissue or fat tissue. In adults, the red marrow gets held in the cavity of the spongy bones of the axial skeleton, the hip bones, and the epiphysis of the long bones. Bones are not smooth, but rather scarred with bumps, holes, and ridges. These bone markings reveal where muscles, tendons, and ligaments attach and where blood vessels and nerves pass through. There are two categories of bone markings: projections and processes, which grow out from the bone surface, and depressions or cavities, which are indentations in the bone. In compact bone, osteocytes or mature bone cells are found in the tiny cavities called lacunae, which are arranged in concentric circles called lamellae around central canals called Haversian canals. Each complex consists of a central canal, and a matrix ring is called an osteon or a Haversian system and is the structural unit of a compact bone. Central canals run lengthwise through a long bone and carry blood vessels and nerves to the bones. Tiny canals called canocula radiate outward from the central canals to all lacunae. The canocula form transportation systems that connect all the bone cells to the nutrient supply and waste removal services through the hard bone matrix. Because of this network, bone is very well nourished and heals really quickly. The canals get connected to the central canal through the Volkmann canals or the perforating canals. This is the microscopic structure of a bone showing the lamella, the osteocyte, which is the cell that goes in between each of those lamella, the canocula, which are those little lines in between the lamellae, the lacuna, which are where the cell goes, the central Haversian canal, which is the center of the matrix of the bone, and then the bone matrix. The skeleton is formed from two of the strongest and most supportive tissues in the body, cartilage and bone. In embryos, the skeleton is primarily made of hyaline cartilage, but in young children, most of the cartilage has been replaced by bone. Cartilage remains only in isolated areas such as the bridge of the nose, parts of the ribs, and in the joints. Except for flat bones, which form on fibrous membranes, most bones develop using hyaline cartilage structure as their models. This process of bone formation, or ossification, involves two major phases. First, the hyaline cartilage model is completely covered with the bone matrix by bone-building cells called osteoblasts. So, as the embryo develops into a fetus, for a short period, it has cartilage bones enclosed by actual bone matrix. Then, the enclosed hyaline cartilage model is replaced by bone, and the center is digested away, opening up the medullary cavity within the newly formed bone. By birth or shortly after, most hyaline cartilage models have been converted to bone except for two regions, the articular cartilages that cover the bone ends and the epiphyseal plates. In order for bones to increase in length as the infant grows into a child, new cartilage is formed continuously on the external face or joint side of the articular cartilage and on the epiphyseal plate surface that faces the bone end. At the same time, the old cartilage abutting the internal face of the articular cartilage and the medullary cavity is broken down and replaced by a bony matrix. Growing bones also widen as they lengthen to maintain proper proportion. Osteoblasts in the periosteum add bone matrix to the outside of the diaphysis, as cells called osteoclasts in the endocrinum remove bone from the inner face of the diaphysis wall. This enlarges the medullary cavity. Because these two processes occur at about the same rate, the circumference of the long bone expands and the bone widens. This process by which bones increase in diameter is also called appositional growth, and like growth in length, is controlled by hormones. The most important hormone are growth hormones, and during puberty, the sex hormones. It ends during adolescence when the epiphyseal plates are completely converted to bones. Most people mistakenly think that bones are lifeless structures that never change once long bone growth has ended. However, bones continually are remodeled in response to changes in two factors. First, the calcium ion level in the blood, and second, the pull of gravity and muscles on the skeleton. When the blood calcium ion level drops below its homeostatic level, the parathyroid glands, which are located in the throat, are stimulated to release parathyroid hormone into the blood. This parathyroid hormone activates osteoclasts which are bone-destroying cells, to break down bone matrix and release calcium ion into the blood. When the blood calcium ion level is too high, calcium is deposited into the bone matrix as hard calcium salts by osteoblasts. Bone remodeling is essential if bones are to retain normal proportions and strength during long bone growth as the body increases in size and weight. It also accounts for the fact that bones become thicker and form large projections to increase their strength in areas where bulky muscles are attached. As such sites, osteoblasts lay down new matrix and become trapped within. In contrast, the bones of bedridden or physically inactive people tend to lose mass and to atrophy because they are no longer subjected to this stress. These two controlling mechanisms, calcium uptake and release as well as bone remodeling, work together. The parathyroid hormone determines when bone is to be broken down or formed in response to the need for more or fewer calcium ions in the blood. The stresses of muscle pull and gravity acting on the skeleton determine where bone matrix is to be broken down or formed so that the skeleton can remain as strong and vital as possible. Despite their strength, bones are susceptible to fractures or breaks throughout life. During youth, most fractures result from exceptional trauma that twists or smashes the bones. Sports activities such as football, skating, and skiing jeopardize the bones, and automobile accidents certainly take their toll. In old age, bones thin and weaken, and fracture occurs much more often. A fracture in which the bone breaks cleanly but does not penetrate the skin is called a closed fracture, or a simple fracture. When the broken bone ends up penetrating through the skin, the fracture is called an open or compound fracture. Some of the many common types of fractures are listed in your book. The repair of bone fractures involves 4 major events. The first is that a hematoma has to form, which just means that there's a blood-filled swelling or bruise that fills in between where the bone broke. Then an internal callus is going to form where fibrocartilage is going to attach the 2 bones or wherever it is that you have a break. It'll attach that break apart, and then new blood vessels will form as well. The third part is that a bony callus will form, which is where you sort of have a spongy type bone that forms from the fibrocartilage before. And then finally, there will be bone remodeling. A fracture is treated by reduction, which means that the bones that are broken will be realigned at their ends, followed by immobilization for anywhere between 6 and 8 weeks. In a closed reduction, the bone ends are coaxed back into their normal position by a physician's hand. However, in an open reduction, surgery has to be performed. Remember that closed reductions or closed breaks would mean that they are breaks that don't perforate the skin, where an open break would break through the skin. This slide shows common types of fractures. The first is the comminuted fracture, which means that the bone has broken into 3 or more fragments. This is especially common in older people who have weak bones, where they would fall and then they would shatter apart, or in some major trauma like a car accident. Compression fractures are where bones are crushed, and it's most common again in older people where they would fall and then crush their skull. You could also have a depressed fracture where the broken bone portion will press inwards. An impacted fracture is when the broken bone ends are forced together due to some sort of impact, like a fall, or if you were playing football and you run into each other, that could cause an impacted fracture. Also in sports, like if you're going to twist your ankle and break your ankle, that twisting force could cause a spiral fracture. And then finally would be green stick fractures. Those fractures are when the bone breaks incompletely, and this happens mostly in small children who have bones that are more flexible rather than the bones that are in adults. Joints are also called articulation, and they're the sites where 2 or more bones meet together. They have 2 major functions. First, they hold all your bones together, and they also allow for the mobility that you have. There are two ways that joints are classified. First is based off of functionality, and second is based off of structure. The functional classification focuses on the amount of movement the joint allows. On this basis, there are synarthroses, or immovable joints, ampharthroses, which are slightly movable joints, and diarthroses, or freely movable joints. Immovable and slightly movable joints are restricted mainly to the axial skeleton, where firm attachments and protection of internal organs are priorities. Freely movable joints are predominantly in the limbs, where mobility is important. Structurally, there are fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial joints. These classifications are based on whether fibrinous tissue, cartilage, or a joint cavity separates the bony regions in the joint. As a general rule, fibrinous joints are immovable and synovial joints are freely movable. Although cartilaginous joints have both immovable and slightly movable examples, most are ampharthrotic. In fibrous joints, the bones are united by fibrinous tissue. The best example of this type of joint are sutures in the skull. In sutures, the irregular edges of the bones interlocked and are bound tightly together by connective tissue fibers, allowing no movement. Cartilaginous joints come in two varieties, which differ in type of cartilage involved. The synchondroses are immovable joints linked by hyaline cartilage. Examples would include the epiphyseal plates of growing long bones and the joints between the ribs and sternum. Symphyses are ampharthrotic joints linked by discs of fibrocartilage, and this would be the example that would be in your invertebral discs in your spinal cord. Synovial joints are the joints in the articulating bone ends that are separated by a joint cavity containing synovial fluid. All joints in the limbs are synovial joints. The types of synovial joints that you should be able to describe are a plane joint, a hinge joint, a pivot joint, the condylar joint, saddle joint, and ball and socket. This picture shows a plane joint. A plane joint would be what's found inside of your hand. In a plane joint, the articular surfaces are essentially flat, and only short, slipping, or gliding movements are allowed. The movements of plane joints are non-axial, that is, gliding back and forth does not involve rotation around any axis. The intercarpal joints of your wrists are the best examples of a plane joint. The second example is a hinge joint. A hinge joint is the cylindrical end of one bone that fits through a trough-shaped surface of another. Angular movement is allowed in just one plane like a door on a hinge. Examples would be the elbow joint, the ankle joint, and the joints between the phalanges of the fingers. Hinge joints are classified as uniaxial. They allow movement around one axis only. In a pivot joint, the rounded end of one bone fits into a sleeve or ring of bone. Because the rotating bone can turn only around its long axis, pivot joints are also uniaxial. To understand the motion of this type of joint, think about a basketball player pivoting around one foot that stays planted in one spot. This example would be where the radius and ulna meet the elbow. That would be an example of a pivot joint. In the condylar joint or knuckle-like joint, the egg-shaped articular surface of one bone fits into an oval concavity of another. Both of these articular surfaces are oval. Condylar joints allow moving bone to travel from side to side and back to forth, but the bone cannot rotate around its long axis. Movement occurs around two axes, hence these joints are called biaxial, as in the knuckle. In saddle joints, each articular surface has both convex and concave areas, like a saddle for a horse. These biaxial joints allow essentially the same movements as condylar joints. The best example of a saddle joint are the carpometacarpal joints of the thumb, which are responsible for the opposable thumb. In a ball and socket joint, the spherical head of one bone fits into the round socket of another. These multi-axial joints allow movement in all axes, including rotation, and are the most freely moving synovial joints. The shoulder and the hips would be examples. The first long bones in a very young fetus are formed of hyaline cartilage, and the earliest flat bones of the skull are actually fibrinous membranes. As the fetus develops and grows, all of the bone models are converted to bone. At birth, the skull has fibrinous regions that have yet to be converted to bone. These fibrinous membranes connecting the cranial bones are called fontanelles. The rhythm of the baby's pulse can be felt in these soft spots. The largest fontanelle is the diamond-shaped anterior fontanelle. The fontanelles allow the fetal skull to be compressed slightly during birth. In addition, because they're flexible, they allow for the infant's brain to grow during the latter part of pregnancy and early infancy. This would not be possible if the cranial bones were fused by sutures, as the adult skull is. The fontanelle is usually fully ossified by 2 years old. The size of the cranium changes as the baby grows. Starting at 2 years old, the skull is about 3/4 the size of an adult skull. Between 8 and 9 years old, the skull is near adult size, but between ages 6 and 11, the face grows out from the skull, which is where you see like the nose protrusion, the mandible starts to come down, and the teeth start to form. At birth, the head and trunk are proportionally much larger than the lower limbs. Then during puberty for the female, the pelvis will broaden and the entire male skeleton becomes more robust, and that's where they get broader shoulders, their hips go in. And then by the end of adolescence, the epiphyseal plates, which are your growth plates, become fully ossified. This image shows the change of a human newborn to a human adult, showing where the nose structure starts to come out, the eye sockets start to widen, the inner part of the temporal lobe starts to go in, and then you can see where the mandible actually forms and goes down to hold the teeth.